நம்முடைய தமிழ் மொழி உலகிலேயே மிகவும் தொன்மையான மொழி. எந்த தேசத்திடம் இருக்கின்றதோ அந்த தேசத்திடம் பெருமிதம் பொங்க வேண்டுமா கூடாதா சொல்லுங்க.
செம்மொழி வலையொலி யூடியூப் சேனல். இந்த சேனலின் மூலமாக, அந்த வலையொலியின் மூலமாக பல்வேறு தகவல்களை தினந்தோறும் நாங்கள் வழங்கி கொண்டிருக்கக்கூடிய அந்த நிலையில் சிலப்பதிகாரம் என்ற தலைப்பில் ஒவ்வொரு பகுதியாக வழங்கக்கூடிய அந்த தொகுப்பை முழுமையாக கண்டு பார்க்கலாம்.
This lecture is a study of the profound influence of Thirukkural on Tolstoy, the noblest of 20th century writers. In his foreword to the two-part anthology, The Pathway of Life, Tolstoy makes the following modest statement. He says, "The sayings in these volumes are of varied authorship, having been gathered from Brahminical, Confucian and Buddhist sources, from the Gospels and the Epistles, and from the works of numerous thinkers, both ancient and modern. The greater part of these sayings have suffered some alteration in form, either as translated or as restated by me, and it is therefore hardly convenient to print them over the signatures of their original authors. The best of these unsigned sayings have their source in the minds of the foremost sages of the world and are not my authorship." This is what he says about his work, The Pathway of Life. From the publisher's preface, we learn that Tolstoy, in the course of his epic career, gathered the pearls of wisdom from the spiritual treasuries of many races and many periods in the history of mankind, retold them in his own language, arranging them under suitable captions and interspersing them with the expressions of his own attitude to the problems of life, and succeeded in collating the consensus of human wisdom and the genius of all lands and all ages into a modern gospel that bears the self-evident impress of divine truth and immortality. This is about the passages that are quoted in this great book. In the collection itself, the sources are mentioned as Brahminic wisdom, Hindu philosophy, Oriental wisdom, Persian wisdom, and Russian proverbs, besides individual names ranging from Confucius to Kant. It appears to be a massive roll call of honor in which several well-known, lesser-known, and hardly known intellectuals drawn from different parts of the world find their place. Among the Indian philosophers and poets, the names thus honored are those of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Vivekananda, Vemana, in addition to the ancient ones such as the Book of Manu, Vishnu Purana. Very strangely, the name of Thiruvalluvar or his magnum opus Thirukkural is not to be found anywhere. This is surprising because we know from reliable sources that the Russian sage thinker wrote a letter to Free Hindustan in 1908 stating that he had read Thirukkural and was extremely impressed with the ideas found in the chapter called Inna Seyyamai, not doing evil. Gandhiji, who was living in South Africa at that time, is said to have read this letter and to have been inspired to study Thirukkural and, what is more, to learn the Tamil language in order to read the work in the original. That the influence of Thirukkural on Tolstoy must have been profound is quite evident from many of the quotes included in both the parts of the pathway of life, as well as from the structure of the entire anthology with its chapter divisions and subheadings. From the translator's note, we understand that the general arrangement, the subheadings, and all unsigned paragraphs and essays in the volume are not those of the editors or the publisher or the translator, but of Tolstoy's own. Any Western reader acquainted with Thirukkural will be able to immediately identify the corresponding chapters in it. In Thirukkural, we have the chapter called Anbudaimai. In Tolstoy's pathway of life, it is love. In Thirukkural, Pedaimai and Pullarivanmai. In Tolstoy, sins, errors and superstitions. In Thirukkural, it is Piranil Vidayamai. In Tolstoy, it is sexual lust. In Thirukkural, Pochavamai and Madiyinmai, there are two chapters. In Tolstoy, we have a chapter on sloth. In Thirukkural, two chapters called Kallamai and Vekkamai. In Tolstoy's pathway of life, it is covetousness. In Thirukkural, Vegulamai. In Tolstoy, anger. In Thirukkural, Adakkamudaimai and Perumai. In Tolstoy, pride, vanity. In Thirukkural, Naduvu Nilaimai. In Tolstoy, inequality. In Thirukkural, Kodungonmai. In Tolstoy, force. In Thirukkural, Ookamudaimai. In Tolstoy, effort. In Thirukkural, Innasayyamai. In Tolstoy, punishment. In Thirukkural, Ozhukkamudaimai and Arul Udaimai. In Tolstoy, doing good and kindness. In Thirukkural, Porai Udaimai. In Tolstoy, on refraining. In Thirukkural, Iniyavai Kural. In Tolstoy, the spoken word. In Thirukkural, Aran Valiyuruttal. In Tolstoy, thought. In Thirukkural, Thuravu. In Tolstoy, self-renunciation. In Thirukkural, Adakkamudaimai. In Tolstoy, humility. In Thirukkural, Vaimai. In Tolstoy, truthfulness. In Thirukkural, Wool. In Tolstoy, the ills of life. In Thirukkural, Nilayamai. In Tolstoy, it is death. It is to be noted that such correspondences are not to be found between Tolstoy's The Pathway of Life and any work other than Thirukkural. If Tolstoy doesn't mention Valluvar by name, it may be because, not knowing much about his life and background, from the English translation, Tolstoy might have used, he would have bracketed Valluvar with the other Indian philosophers, the sources of whose wise sayings are referred to as Hindu philosophy or Oriental wisdom or even as Brahminic wisdom. Since in the old English translations of Thirukkural, the introduction invariably gave prominence to the legend about Valluvar's parentage and life. But it is clear that from his chapter on inequality that Tolstoy was totally opposed to the Hindu Varna system, Varnashrama Dharma. Tolstoy condemns that, saying, one of the oldest and most profound of all faiths is the faith of the Hindus. The reason that it has never become universal faith and has failed to yield such fruit in the life of men as it should have yielded is due to the fact that its teachers acknowledged men to be unequal and divided them into castes. People acknowledging themselves unequal cannot have a true religion. This is how he condemns Varnashrama Dharma. That Tolstoy has such subheadings in the chapter Inequality as the substance of the error of inequality, excuses for inequality, all men brethren, all men are equal, why are all men equal, is evidence enough to show that the division of the human race on the basis of birth was anathema to Tolstoy. Many of the statements in that chapter remind us of the following couplets in Thirukkural. Pirapakkum ella uyirkkum. In birth all men are equal, then merit differs with the difference of their deeds. Another couplet, one is not great because of one's birth in a noble family. One is not low because of one's birth in a poor family. Tolstoy emphatically states, echoing these couplets, one can understand people considering themselves unequal because one has a stronger body than another, or is more alert, or knows more, or is kindlier than another. But these are not the usual reasons why some men are accounted higher than others. They are accounted unequal because one is named a count and another a peasant in Russian culture, because one wears expensive clothes and the other sandals. It is said that some 5 or 6 couplets in the chapter Inna Seyyamai were so alluring that Tolstoy translated them into Russian. The impact of the message conveyed by the following couplets on his chapters on evil doing as well as on some of his short stories is unmistakable. It is the nature of noble men, Tolstoy says, it is the nature of noble men not to cause harm even to those that do evil because of malice. The punishment for those who have done evil is to put them to shame by showing kindness to them. Of what avail, as Thirukkural says, of what avail is wisdom to a man if he does not feel as his own the pain suffered by other beings? Another couplet, when a man has felt a pain for himself, let him not inflict it on others. One more, it is the chief of virtues never to do the least harm to anyone. All harm befalls, Valluvar says, those who do harm to others. Those who desire freedom from ill will abstain from wrongdoing. In the chapter Punishment, Tolstoy condemns the human weakness to render evil for evil. In the animal world, evil calls for evil, and the animal, unable to restrain the evil provoked in it, endeavors to repay evil with evil, not realizing that evil inevitably augments evil. But man, being endowed with reason, cannot help seeing that evil augments evil and should therefore refrain from repaying evil with evil. And again Tolstoy says, render good for evil and you destroy in the evil doer all the pleasure he sees in evil. And one more passage, if you think that someone is guilty before you, forget it and forgive, and you will learn the happiness of forgiving. In the short story by Tolstoy, where love is, there God is also, an old apple woman is asked to forgive a little boy who steals an apple from her basket and is about to be punished. The protagonist of the story asks her to forgive the boy. God has commanded us to forgive, said he, else we too may not be forgiven. All should be forgiven, and the thoughtless especially. When the old woman forgives the boy, both are reconciled to each other, and the latter, that is the boy, happily offers to carry the entire bag on his back. In the chapter, there is one soul in all. Tolstoy observes, men think it right to eat animals because they are led to believe that God sanctions it. This is untrue. No matter in what books it may be written that it is not sinful to slay animals and to eat them, it is more clearly written in the heart of man than in any books that animals are to be pitied and should not be slain any more than human beings. We all know this if we do not choke the voice of our conscience. And one of the short stories by Tolstoy, The Bear Hunt, gives an extremely realistic account of a bear hunting expedition. The editors of the collection, 23 Tales, the title of the collection is 23 Tales, they say in an introductory note that the adventure here narrated is one that happened to Tolstoy himself in 1858, and that more than 20 years later he gave up hunting on humanitarian grounds. What is interesting about Tolstoy's condemnation of meat eating is that almost all the sources he quotes in The Pathway of Life have nothing to say against meat eating, though some of them, including the Buddhist writings, eulogize compassion and love for animals. Thirukkural alone has one chapter on abjuring of flesh meat and another on not killing, kollamai. In the former, Thirukkural categorically observes, how can a man possess compassion if he eats the flesh of other creatures in order to fatten himself? Another couplet, to abstain from killing and eating of living beings is far nobler than to perform 1,000 sacrifices pouring out libations of ghee. Another couplet, all living beings will fold their hands together and worship him who doesn't kill and abjures flesh. Another couplet, he praises in another chapter, he praises non-killing as the chief virtue. If it is asked what is a righteous deed, it is non-killing. Killing brings in all the other evil deeds. One more couplet, even if one loses one's life, one shouldn't do the deed that will take the life of another. Emphasizing the need to love one another, the chapter Love contends, that is by Tolstoy, the chapter Love contends that loving all people is not a difficult virtue to put in practice. Tolstoy says, to love all men seems difficult, but all things are difficult until you learn how to do them. Men can learn anything, to sow, to weave, to till the soil, to mow, to forge iron, to read and to write. Even so, they must learn how to love all people. And to learn to do this is not difficult because loving one another has been ingrained in our hearts. Man would clearly comprehend that he feels happy only when there is love in his soul for others. And again he emphasizes the importance of love. Love gives but seeks nothing in return. Numerous stories by Tolstoy stress that love is God and that love for God manifests itself best in love for fellow human beings. The short story Two Old Men by Tolstoy presents two different characters who undertake a pilgrimage to Jerusalem together. Though the two, Ephraim and Elisha, they are the names of the two, Ephraim and Elisha start together. They get separated on the way because Elisha, getting tired, wants to rest and have a drink, while the other continues the journey all alone. In order to have a drink, Elisha goes to a hut where he finds a miserable family suffering from utter poverty. Postponing his journey day after day, he stays with them and helps them in all possible ways, spending his money. When the family is freed from all its woes and feels confident to sustain itself without any more help, Elisha feels that it would be better for him to return home than to continue the trip to the pilgrim center. Ephraim, on the other hand, reaches Jerusalem and experiences a strange phenomenon. Whenever he goes to church to pray, he sees Elisha at a distance in the large gathering, but is never able to reach him and talk to him. When he returns home, very strangely, he meets the family that has now become prosperous because of the timely help rendered by Elisha. They tell him, "We were dying in despair, murmuring against God and man, but he set us on our feet again, and through him we learned to know God and to believe that there is good in man. May the Lord bless him. We used to live like animals. He made human beings of us." Now Elisha realizes what has really happened. He cannot get Elisha out of his mind and remembers how he saw his friend 3 times at Jerusalem standing in the foremost place. So that is how he got ahead of me, he tells himself. God may or may not have accepted my pilgrimage, but he has certainly accepted his. By this story, Tolstoy drives home the message that the best way to keep one's vows to God and to do his will is for each man while he lives to show love and do good to others. The opening chapter of Thirukkural is in praise of God, but all the following chapters deal exclusively with life here and now, focusing its attention in several chapters, several couplets on the need to care for one's family, kith and kin, neighbors and the entire mankind without making any invidious distinctions. If to a family man it is love for those who are close to him, to the ascetics it is compassion for the whole mankind that is a must. The loveless appropriate all they have to themselves, but those who possess love will sacrifice even their bones to help others. These are the statements about love by Thiruvallur. The wise say that the union of soul and body yields one fruit, the life of love alone. Virtue will burn up loveless life just as the scorching sun burns up the boneless worm. The life of a loveless man is like the flowering of a withered tree on a hard desert. Of what avail are the external limbs of the human body if men have no place for love in the heart? Life subsists by love. The man who has no love is only a mass of skin encased bone. Again and again, Tolstoy asserts that love is genuine only when it embraces all, and that just as the human body craves food and suffers when deprived of it, the soul of man craves love and suffers when deprived of it. Tolstoy says, every man knows that he must do those things which unite him with people rather than those which separate him from them. He knows it not because anyone has so commanded him, but because the more he unites with people, the better he lives, and on the contrary, the more he separates from them, the worse is his life. The message is aptly illustrated in the story Father Sergius by Tolstoy again. Having lived the life of a monk and a hermit, this Sergius finally realizes that he has lived his life in vain, whereas Pashanka, whom he first met as a young girl, later as the wife of a landowner who squandered all her fortune and was in the habit of beating her, and finally as a widow living in a country town where she had to support a huge family consisting of her daughter, her ailing son-in-law and her 5 grandchildren, is an ideal model that he ought to have followed. He says he has realized that I lived for men on the pretext of living for God, while she lived for God, imagining that she lives for men. Yes, one good deed, a cup of water given without thought of reward, is worth more than that any benefit I imagined I was bestowing on people. Finally, he settles down in Siberia as the hired man of a well-to-do peasant, in which capacity he works in the kitchen garden, teaches children and attends to the sick. In a full chapter of 10 couplets, Valluvar sings the merits of family life, firmly asserting that it is superior to the life of a recluse. These are the couplets. If one lives as a householder, following the path of righteousness, what benefit is there to achieve by adopting the other path of life? Among all those who strive for happiness, he is the greatest who leads a simple family life. The domestic life that does not swerve from virtue and keeps others in the right path is superior to the life of ascetics. He who lives a domestic life as it ought to be lived will be placed among the gods in heaven. In the essay Surfeit, Tolstoy calls it a sin to drug oneself with wine, tobacco and opium. He says in the course of the story, if wine, tobacco and opium did not dull the reason and thereby did not give free rein to evil desires, no one would drink bitter beverages or inhale fumes. And yet to people, to avoid the trouble of following the true path, extinguish the only light that they have, that is their reason, by smoking and drinking. There are at least 3 stories by Tolstoy which highlight the harmfulness of drinking. In Polikushka, the chief character is fond of strong drink. His love of strong drink has so overcome every moral instinct that at times he was scarcely responsible for his actions. This causes his ultimate ruin by forcing him to do a shameful deed leading to suicide. In another short story, The Imp and the Crust, an imp serving the devil spoils an innocent peasant by teaching him to make a strong drink and serve it to the other peasants of the village, all of whom start behaving like brutes. Boasting of its achievement, the imp tells the devil, and I showed him a pleasure drinking. And when he began to turn God's good gifts into spirits for his own pleasure, the foxes, the wolves, and swine's blood in him all came out. If only he goes on drinking, he will always be a beast. In a story called The Young Tsar, a young ruler is admonished for not stopping people from drinking. It is Tolstoy's voice that is loudly heard in the speeches of one of the chief characters of the story, condemning this particular evil of drinking. The whole village has been drunk for the last 3 days, and as for feast days, it is simply horrible to think of. It has been proved conclusively that alcohol does no good in any case, but invariably does harm, and it has been demonstrated to be an absolute poison. Then 99% of the crimes in the world are continued through its influence. We all know how the standard of morality and the general welfare improved at once in all the countries where drinking has been suppressed, like Sweden and Finland, and we know that it can be suppressed by exercising a moral influence over the masses. But in our country, the class which could exert that influence, that is the government, the Tsar and his officials, simply encourage drink. Their main revenues are drawn from the continual drunkenness of the people. They drink themselves, they are always drinking the health of somebody, gentlemen, the regiment. The preachers drink, the bishops drink. The chapter on abstaining from drink is significantly placed in Thirukkural in the part called Porul, which is largely meant for kings and their subordinates, though Valluvar comes down heavily on all those who drink and ruin their lives. These are the couplets. Let none drink, but let those men drink who do not care for the esteem of noble men. The virtuous maid of modesty will turn her back on those who are guilty of the abominable crime of drunkenness. Spending money to lose one's sense is the height of stupidity. They that sleep are not very different from the dead. They that drink toddy are not very different from those that drink poison. Reasoning with a drunkard is like searching with a torch for a man lost in deep waters. In the short articles on sexual lust, Tolstoy has a number of lessons on the sanctity of marriage and the sin of adultery. He says in the course of some of these short stories, marriage is the promise of two persons, a man and a woman, who have children, to have children only one from the other. A good marriage, if it is to attain its purpose, can only be when the man has no more wives and the woman has no more husbands than they need for the education of their children, which means only when the husband has one wife and the wife one husband. Think 10, 20, 100 times before you marry. To bind your life with that of another person in sexual relation is a matter of great import. Therefore, that marriage wherein the contracting parties desire no children is worse than adultery and any depravity. A story called The Empty Drum is about a king who, lusting for a peasant's wife, makes several wicked attempts to get her for himself. The peasant is given 3 impossible tasks to perform, failing which he will be killed. But his wife, endowed with supernatural powers, saves her husband on all occasions, and the king is shown his place. Tolstoy's emphasis on the holiness of wedding and on the everlasting bond between one man and one woman, and of his condemnation of adultery and even of living with more than one woman may now look very strange in the modern era. In the past, Western and Aryan cultures did not lay so much of stress on one man being bound to one woman for life. In fact, the Vedic religion insisted that a Brahmin, while conducting the yajna, should do it with 3 or 4 wives, but Valluvar castigated in no uncertain terms adultery and prostitution even 2000 years ago. These are the couplets. What greater things are there than a wife if she possesses the steadfastness called chastity? They who regard virtue will eschew adulterous thoughts as the worst of all follies. They who betray a trusting friend and tempt his wife to ill are dead to all human virtue. However great one may be, what does it avail if without thinking of the shame one seeks a neighbor's wife? He who thinks lightly of trespassing into another's home will earn for himself eternal infamy. The manly nobleness that does not lust after another's wife is not only virtue but the path of right conduct. In the chapter called Sloth, Tolstoy celebrates physical labor, especially the toil of tilling the soil. He says, agriculture is not merely one of the occupations proper to man. Agriculture is the one occupation proper to all men. Agricultural labor gives man maximum of freedom and the maximum of happiness. To him who does not till the earth says, because thou dost not work with me, with thy right hand and with thy left, thou shalt always stand before the door of the stranger with other beggars, thou shalt always live on the offal of the rich. In our present mode of life, the most futile and useless work receives the greatest reward, Tolstoy says. Work in sweatshops, tobacco factories, pharmacies, banks, business offices, or at literature, music, etc. But agricultural labor is the poorest paid. If money rewards be considered of importance, this is very unjust. But if one considers the joy of labor and its effect upon the health of the body and the fascination of it, such a division of reward is perfectly just, he says. Though peasants and peasant life receive high praise in several short stories by Tolstoy, Ilias, Ivan the Fool, and Work, Death and Sickness, these 3 short stories are particularly devoted to the glorification of agricultural labor. The message of the story called Ilias is that it is labor that gives unalloyed happiness. My old man and I lived for 50 years seeking happiness and not finding it. And it is only now, these last 2 years, that the character says, these last 2 years, since we had nothing left and have lived as laborers, that we have found real happiness, and we wish for nothing better than our present lot. Ivan the Fool presents 3 brothers who choose 3 different occupations. Simeon, one of them, goes to war to serve the Tsar. Taras goes to a city and becomes a merchant. Ivan, the youngest, remains at home to work on the farm. The first two miserably fail in their careers and have to seek refuge under Ivan, who, forgetting their wickedness, is prepared to feed them and their families. The story ends with the statement, "There is only one unchangeable custom observed in Ivan's kingdom." Now he has become the ruler of a kingdom. "The man with toil-hardened hands is always given a seat at the table, while the possessor of soft white hands must be contented with what is left." Work, death and sickness, the other story, reported by the author himself to be a legend common among the South American Indians, presents God as the protagonist, trying to force men to understand where their happiness lies. It takes a lot of time for some of them to realize, for some of these people to realize, that work ought not to be a bugbear to some, unlike galley slavery for others, but should be a common and happy occupation uniting all men. The so-called Dharma Shastras in Sanskrit, led by the laws of Manu, consider ploughing beneath the dignity of Brahmins and assign it to Sudras, the lowest group in the Hindu Varna system. But Thirukkural, in a chapter devoted to farming, states that it is beyond a shadow of doubt the worthiest job of mankind. These are the couplets. However wide they may roam about in the world, people have to follow the tiller of the soil for their food. Farming is therefore the best of all occupations. Ploughmen are the linchpin of society, for they support all the rest who cannot till the soil. They alone truly live who live by ploughing the field. The rest have to be subservient, eating what they give. Those whose nature is to live by manual labor will never beg, but will give alms ungrudgingly to those that beg. If a farmer stays at home without attending to his cultivation, his land will sulk like an angry wife and yield him no pleasure. Earth, the kindly dame, will laugh at those who plead poverty and remain idle. This is how Valluvar celebrates farming. The senselessness of anger is delineated by Tolstoy in a long chapter. No matter how much harm anger causes to others, he says, it is most harmful to him who harbors it. Cinnamonnum சேர்ந்தாரை கொல்லி. And anger is always more harmful than that which has provoked it. Even as the rain puts out the flames, so compassion acts upon wrath. There is only one way to keep from hating those who injure us. It is by doing good to them. Though you may not be able to change them, you can curb yourself. These are all echoes from Valluvar's couplets, these statements by Tolstoy on anger. You think that the object of your wrath is your enemy, yet your own wrath, which has entered your heart, is your principal enemy. Therefore, make peace with your enemy as quickly as possible and put out of your head that painful sentiment. There is a story called Evil Alludes but Good Endures by Tolstoy. It is a story of one who, resisting the temptations of the devil, overcomes his anger and forgives his slave who does a lot of harm to him. When the treacherous deed of the slave, Alab is the name of the slave, is known to the master naturally gets wild, but after reflecting a while conquers his anger. Tolstoy gives a graphic description of the master's experience of anger. This is the description. The master looked as black as thunder, frowned, bent his head, and did not say a word. After remaining silent for a while, the master shook himself as if to throw off some burden. Then he lifted his head and, raising his eyes heavenward, remained so for a short time. Presently, the wrinkles passed from his face and he looked down at the slave with a smile, saying, "O Aleb, Aleb, your master bade you anger me, but my master is stronger than yours. I am not angry with you, but I will make your master angry. You are afraid that I shall punish you, and you have been wishing for your freedom. Know then, Aleb, that I shall not punish you, but as you wish to be free. Here, before my guests, I set you free. Go where you like and take your holiday garment with you." The story will remind all the Tamil readers of the famous couplet in Thirukkural, which Tolstoy is also reported to have read and admired. This is the couplet. "The punishment for those who have done evil to you is to put them to shame by showing great kindness to them and then forgetting the whole happening." There is another couplet which stresses the same lesson in a different context. Of what avail is one's nobility if it does not do good even to those who have done evil to it? It is in the chapter called Abstaining from Anger that Valluvar explains how and why one should refrain from anger. Give up wrath with anyone. It is the source of countless evils. Is there a worse enemy than anger, which kills laughter and delight? If a man would like to protect himself, let him keep anger away. If he doesn't do it, anger will kill him. Anger, the killer of those who harbor it, will also burn up their kinsmen who are his lifeboats. If a man banishes anger from his heart, he will achieve all that he longs for. If Valluvar has one chapter on Ookamudaimai, energy, determination to act, and another on Madi in Mai, against sloth, against laziness. Tolstoy has two chapters called Effort and Sloth. In Effort, Tolstoy asserts that to become even better is the whole concern of life, and one can become better only by effort, and that only by efforts of his consciousness can man be delivered from sins, errors, and superstitions which deprive him of happiness. In Sloth, he points out how idleness is harmful. He says, "Do not be ashamed of any labor, even the dirtiest. Be ashamed of one thing only, namely idleness. The activities of idle men are such that instead of easing the labors of the working people, they impose upon them additional burdens. The devil fishing for men uses all sorts of bait, but the idle man needs no bait, he is caught with a bare hook." Many of the short stories of Tolstoy present poor peasants who work hard, lead hand-to-mouth life, but are happy, and in contrast, rich landowners who idle away their time, though possessing enormous wealth, never have a delightful day. The gap between the toiling poor and the idle rich engaged the heart and mind of Tolstoy and worried him so much when he was over 80 that he thought of laying bare the truth of his feelings in the story called There Are No Guilty People. In the story, the life of Volgin, a bachelor and a clerk in a Moscow bank at a salary of 8,000 rubles a year, is contrasted with the life of Mitri, a poor peasant who has 5 children and is forced to beg when his only horse dies. The story ends with the author's meditation on the misery of mankind. Tolstoy says, here is a bachelor, grown old, the owner of thousands of acres, who had lived a life of idleness, greed and overindulgence, who reads the New Times and is astonished that the government can be so unwise as to permit Jews to enter the university. Here is a kind, gentle mother of a little girl reading a story to her about a fox, a dog that lamed some rabbits. And here is this little girl, during her walks, she sees other children barefooted, hungry, hunting for green apples that have fallen from the trees, and so accustomed is she to the sight that these children do not seem to her to be children such as she is, but only part of the usual surroundings, the familiar landscape. Why is this? Tolstoy asks. Valluvar makes plenty of profound observations on the possession of a powerful will as well as on the destruction caused by laziness. Here are the couplets. Wealth will ask the way to find the man of unfailing energy. Whatever you may think, let your aim be lofty. Even if something noble were unattainable, it is enough that it has been aimed at. The strong-minded will not lose heart when they face defeat. The elephant stands firm and keeps up its majesty even when hit by a shower of arrows. The family of the fool who hugs a sloth in his own lap will punish even before he is dead. Though gods may ordain failure, sustained physical labor will yield its own reward. They who labor strenuously, unremittingly and perseveringly will overcome even destiny. There are couplets in which Valluvar urges the rich to be compassionate and go to the help of the poor without expecting anything in return. These are the couplets. All wealth won by honest toil is meant for the use of the needy. The wealth of men of eminent knowledge is like the village tank filled with water. The wealth possessed by men of liberal heart is like the ripening of a fruit-bearing tree in the heart of the village. If ruin comes as a result of benevolence, it is worth quoting even by selling one's own self. Valluvar is also equally concerned with the gap between the haves and the have-nots, a universal phenomenon which is intriguing to those who believe in God. Valluvar condemns the heartless rich and sympathizes with the lot of the poor to such an extent that he curses the Creator if he happens to be ultimately responsible for this sad state of affairs. Here is the couplet. The world falls into two categories which are mutually exclusive. Some live by acquiring wealth and others by acquiring discriminative wisdom. Fate seems to have a double sway. It makes the foolish rich and the wise poor. Another couplet. If the Creator of the world has decreed that men must beg to live, may he too go begging and perish. If Tolstoy has one chapter on covetousness, Valluvar condemns this evil in 3 chapters under the headings Kallamai, Bekhamai and Ava Aruttal. In Tolstoy's view, the sin of covetousness consists in the acquisition of ever-increasing quantities of things or money of which others stand in need, and in the retention of the same in order to use at will the labor of others. In order to be blessed, man should pay heed not to the increase of his possessions. This is Tolstoy's advice. In order to be blessed, man should pay heed not to the increase of his possessions, but of the love within himself. With what effort and sin riches are gathered and preserved, and yet there is but one joy to be had of accumulated riches. This joy consists in giving up the riches after realizing all the evil thereof. How much land does a man need? That is the title of a short story by Tolstoy, and this story has been deservingly praised by James Joyce. How much land does a man need? This has been praised by James Joyce as the greatest story that the literature of the world knows. The chief character of the story desires to have plenty of land so that he need not fear even the devil. He keeps buying hundreds of acres of land and finally meets the Bashkirs who are prepared to give him as much of land, the people of land, they are prepared to give him as much of land as he can go round on his feet in a day for 1,000 rubles, on the condition that if he doesn't return on the same day to the spot from where he starts, he will lose his money. This man, Pahom is his name, covers such a long distance that it is with great difficulty that he can reach the starting point, but thoroughly exhausted by the foolish attempt, he dies at the end. Tolstoy concludes the story on a note of irony. He says, this character, his servant picked up the spade and dug a grave long enough for Pahom to lie in and buried him in it. 6 feet from his head to his heels was all he needed. In the story, a grain as big as a hen's egg, a very old man tells the king that if during his time a grain was as big as a hen's egg, it was because men of his days lived by their own labor and never coveted what others had produced. Valluvar's couplets on covetousness hit the nail on its head. These are the couplets. Even the very thought of craftily stealing the property of another is evil. Even the thought is evil. The wise who have conquered their senses and are free from crime will not covet the things of others, feeling that they are destitute. Tolstoy has 3 chapters called Pride, Vanity and Humility, whereas Valluvar has 2 with the titles Perumai and Adakkamudaimai, all of which strive to teach the lesson that humility is wisdom. Condemning the senseless folly of pride, Tolstoy contends that man has no rational grounds for exalting himself above others, as the same Spirit of God dwells in all people. He says, it is foolish for people to be proud of their face or of their body, but it is still greater folly to be proud of their parents and friends, of their estate and of their race. Another statement, the prouder a man, the more foolish is he, thought of by those who make use of his pride, nor are they mistaken, because though they flagrantly deceive him, he fails to see through it. Pride is invariably foolish. Man has his own tribunal within himself, which is his conscience. Only its judgment should be cherished. Vanity is the first and crudest remedy against animal passions, but later you must deliver yourself of the remedy. There is but one cure to live for the soul. Self-assurance is a characteristic of the animal. Humility is a characteristic of man. Humility unites men in love. The main character of his short story, My Dream, is a proud prince who comes to grief because his daughter. Tolstoy has 3 chapters called Pride, Vanity and Humility, whereas Valluvar has 2 with the titles Perumai and Adakkam Udaimai, all of which strive to teach the lesson that humility is wisdom. Condemning the senseless folly of pride, Tolstoy contends that man has no rational grounds for exalting himself above others, as the same Spirit of God dwells in all people. He says, it is foolish for people to be proud of their face or of their body, but it is still greater folly to be proud of their parents and friends, of their estate and of their race. Another statement, the prouder a man, the more foolish is he thought of by those who make use of his pride, nor are they mistaken, because though they most flagrantly deceive him, he fails to see through it. Pride is invariably foolish. Man has his own tribunal within himself, which is his conscience. Only his judgment should be cherished. Vanity is the first and crudest remedy against animal passions, but later you must deliver yourself of the remedy. There is but one cure to live for the soul. Self-assurance is a characteristic of the animal. Humility is a characteristic of man. Humility unites men in love. The main character of the story, My Dream, is a proud prince who comes to grief because his daughter, without his approval or knowledge, marries an insignificant Swede, a student, an empty-headed, worthless creature and already married. The prince is known for his proud bearing. At luncheon, before the family and guests, he had been witty and sarcastic as usual towards everyone excepting the children, whom he treated with almost reverent tenderness. He adopted an attitude of distant indifference. Yet it was so natural to him that everyone somehow acknowledged his right to be proud. In spite of repeated appeals by his sister-in-law, the proud prince is unable to forgive his daughter and lives a grief-stricken life. While defining any virtue, Valluvar's practice is not to make any qualifications, but to authoritatively assert that it is the greatest of all virtues, not because he is unaware of how he has represented other virtues, but because people shouldn't think of making compromise with regard to any virtue. It is with this aim that he expatiates on the need for self-control, modesty and humility. These are the couplets. God's self-control as a very treasure. There is no richer wealth than that for living beings. The appearance of a man who, without swerving from his proper state, controls himself is far grander than a mountain. Being humble is good for all, but it is splendid wealth to the wealthy. If in one life a man controls his five senses just as a tortoise draws its limbs within itself, that will be a safeguard in all the seven births. Greatness always humbles itself, but meanness exalts itself in self-admiration. Greatness is free from arrogance and insolence. Littleness is rooted in pride. Greatness hides the faults of others, but smallness will proclaim them to the whole world. With regard to individual virtues forcefully advocated by Thirukkural and Tolstoy, there are striking similarities, but there is a vital difference in the way they view mankind and in their conception of the end and meaning of human life. In The Pathway of Life by Tolstoy and in the short stories, he invariably mentions them as Christian virtues, and in support of them has more quotes from the Bible than from any other source. There are elaborate sections called faith, God, the soul, there is one soul in all, false religions, false science, after death, doing his will, and finally the teachings of Jesus. The association of all his principles with Christianity as understood and interpreted by him is quite evident. It is to be remembered that during his old age, Tolstoy entertained extreme moralistic and ascetic views and became a social reformer and a moral thinker in the 1870s. He was excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901 for a radical anarcho-pacifist Christian philosophy. His ideas on non-violent resistance are powerfully expressed in The Kingdom of God is Within You, one of his essays. Unlike Valluvar, Tolstoy makes frequent references to God and the will of God. He says, we cannot know God, only this we can know about Him, His law and His will as related to us in the New Testament. Knowing His law, we draw the conclusion that He exists, who has given the law, but we cannot know the lawgiver Himself. Again, frequently speaking of the soul, Tolstoy contends that the life of man is not in the body but in the soul, not in the body and in the soul, but in the soul alone. Defining false religions as those which people follow not because they have need of them for their soul's sake, but because they have faith in them who expound them. He argues that between a shaman and a European prelate, or between a crude sensual heathen and a Connecticut Puritan, there may be a difference in methods, but there is no difference in the fundamentals of their faiths, for both belong to that class of people whose idea of serving God is not in becoming better men, but in religion or in observing of certain arbitrary rules. It is ultimately a tragic vision of life that emerges out of Tolstoy's essays and stories. Horrified by the sufferings of men and women all around him, he must have felt that life is not worth living. In Sexual Lust, in that essay, he even advises the human race to cease propagating itself by striving after absolute chastity. He says, it is well to live in honorable matrimony, but it is better never to marry. It is untrue that chastity is contrary to the nature of man. Chastity is possible and yields much more happiness than even a happy marriage. And he goes on to say, if men marry and think that they thereby serve God and man, because they propagate the human species, they deceive themselves. Instead of marrying in order to increase the number of children in the world, it would be far simpler to sustain and save those millions of young lives which are perishing from want and neglect. Tolstoy advances a strange argument in favor of his wild suggestion. Some say that if all were chaste, the human species would cease to exist. But does not the church teach, he asks, does not the church teach that the end of the world is bound to come? And science equally shows that someday man's life upon earth and earth itself must cease. Though Valluvar makes occasional references to the relationship between body and soul, to the cycle of births and to heaven and hell, his focus is always on life on earth at any given time and in any place of the world. He may speak of the miseries of life and the predominant presence of evil, but he never says directly or indirectly no to life. Most of the virtues recommended in the 20 chapters on family life and in the 13 chapters on the life of ascetics are equally applicable to both ways of life. The ascetic choosing a life of penance is not expected to live far away from householders and to care only for the salvation of his soul. He has to be more compassionate than the householder and help the rest of mankind in all possible ways. During Valluvar's time, Vedic religions, Buddhism, Jainism and numerous other sects might have flourished in different parts of India. He doesn't accept all the beliefs of any particular religion and makes a judicious choice and advocates an eclectic philosophy of life. He is not interested in talking over enthusiastically about God, about the soul, or about the past or the future, but in teaching what one ought to do and what one ought not to do in this life. To him, what matters to the entire mankind is good living on earth, and all things outside of good, upright and clean living are absolutely immaterial. Thank you.